Welcome to the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, a different kind of grief conversation. Rye, if you would just go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about this topic, coming to this experience of grief, having had many experiences of grief prior to this that were so very different than the experience you're going to speak about with your mom.
Thanks for the intro, Susan. And again, I just want to reiterate that what I love is being part of a community where people really authentically care about dying consciously. I really agree with the Bhutanese tradition that if you think of death 5 times a day, it leads to a happier life. And all of this death contemplation really is about living more fully, because what's the point about planning for death unless we're living more fully? That to me is the whole story, the whole circle. And Susan, you asked about what my story was with death before I had this amazing experience with my mom's death. And I was thinking about it the last day or two in preparation, for this interview. And it lined up for me in a way of like just how traumatic death has been in my life. I want to say, I hope it's not hard for people to hear, but it is stuff I don't say that much. And then it's when I was in college, I was part of a strong activist feminist community. And one night, this woman, while she was sleeping, was butchered to death by a deranged person for her political beliefs. And I was just completely catatonic about that. I could not understand. I was maybe 20 or 21 years old. And, I grew up in New York, and I, this was all the way in Olympia, Washington. And just my mind could not conceive of being murdered for standing up for human rights. And very soon after that, I became a support person. It's a very long, strange story, but this other woman at college, her friend had, her friend and her friend's friend had been murdered by the Marin County trail killer that some of you might know of. He murdered 10 women. And this was 2 that she knew of, and I became her support person. It was a very, very intense experience and really affected me deeply. About a year and a half later, my dear friend, all of this is happening in Olympia, Washington. The Marin County trail killer targeted women hiking alone at Mount Tamalpais and Marin Point Reyes. My very dear friend was murdered by the same man, tortured and raped and murdered. And I don't know that I still really sometimes struggle about her death. But these were very formative things for me in my early 20s. And a few years later, I was in graduate school and I was in film school. And the office manager of the film department and I hit up this friendship, and there wasn't a day that I didn't go see her and laugh with her. And one day she was driving in a car with her son too fast. The car flipped and they were both killed instantly. The very next year, a student, another colleague, peer, said, I have something that hurts me here. And I was like, oh, I'm a massage therapist. I'm sure it's a knot. and he was dead within a year of cancer in his lungs. So these were the things that really deeply affected me. And somewhere around that same time, I got a call from a cousin. I never had gotten a call from him before telling me that his father had died. So in my 20s, these things happened, and I just felt bizarre about death. I couldn't reconcile it. I couldn't figure it out, like, couldn't understand it. I had a very strong spiritual path that was based on pretty much Eastern traditions, Buddhism and Hinduism. And those were the things that helped me. And I always say, as an end of life doula, it really is my spiritual path or my spiritual practice on the path. So, more deaths happened in my 30s that were not traumatic, thankfully, that were from sickness and old age, grandparents and aunts and uncles. And then my sister got sick with breast cancer. It metastasized to her brain. At the time of death, she had 18 tumors in her brain and was very, very deranged. And her death was such an incredible relief and release from suffering. And I was there and involved. It was just very different to experience it that way. That year, when my mom lost her eldest daughter, she also lost her husband. And she lived in Florida, and she was like, I'm done, no more cooking, no more cleaning, no more driving. Can I come out to you? And of course she could. And she lived in a facility a mile from my home for 4 years before she died. And during this time period, my mom was a very gentle, quiet person, very strong, really strong. We like got her will together, her trust together, her advanced care directive. I knew all of her wishes. She would tell me what it was like to be in her body that was declining and decaying. She got on hospice, and it was so helpful to her that she stabilized. She's just having, she didn't have any cognitive decline. She had COPD and congestive heart failure, and breathing was hard, and walking was hard. And she was in her 90s. So she was admitted to hospice. Hospice nurses just were in love with my mom. They would fight over like who could come see her because they just loved her, and she would give them chocolate and make them laugh. And she was just mentally really preparing to die. And she fell a couple times, and we're in the emergency room at 3 in the morning a few times, and just the whole thing is happening, the whole slow movement towards death. And she just would talk about, I really have outlived my body. I don't want to go through this anymore. And that really stayed with me. And we got to share our love and share our goodbyes. I knew all of her wishes. She got kicked off of hospice because she was stable. That was the worst 2 weeks until we got her back on to hospice because she completely fell apart. It was so traumatic to her to get kicked off. And then she just was always, she got back on, all her meds got straightened away, and then she just could not let go of the fear of being kicked off again. She also would not let them give her morphine, small amounts of morphine, because she just associated morphine with dying. So it took about two of the 2.5 years she was on hospice until I and the nurses could convince her it would just a small amount would just open her airways and just let breathing happen. And once she did that, the last 6 months of her life, she really just relaxed a lot more. Just a tiny amount of morphine made all the difference. And so Donald Trump was elected in 2016, November. She was like, I don't want to be around anymore. I don't want to see what he's going to do to this country. I think about that a lot to this day. And I had a few months later, I had my big 60th birthday, and my spouse and kids and best friend, we were all going on a trip to New York City, the best city in the world. And I was like, okay, Mom, you cannot die while I am away. And she was like, okay, Rye, but when you get back, it is my turn. And sure enough, 2 days later, after my return, she had a minor heart event and took to her bed, and she died about 9 days later. And she felt loved. The nurses were there. They were amazing round the clock, 24 hours a day. There was me and a nurse would, come and stay for a nice good while, like an hour or two until the next nurse would come a few hours later. My kids came and said goodbye. My former spouse came and said goodbye. She talked to my sister on the phone and said goodbye. She talked to my cousin, her niece that she was very close with, on the phone and said goodbye. She sang to me, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. And I got to record a lot of this. And I have these little clips. And she was just so at peace, so ready. So she embraced death. She reached towards death. She was just in this place of light and love. And she just lifted me right up into it. It was so unlike these other deaths. And she died. I left at midnight. I just had to go to sleep. It's really an extraordinary experience to sit bedside, pretty much 24/7. It's beyond exhausting. It's beyond beautiful and essential and moving. And that night, I was like, I really think I have to go to bed. I have to sleep in my bed because I think I'm going to lose it tomorrow if I don't. And a hospice volunteer came at right, like, I think I actually saw her, if I remember correctly. And an hour and a half later, my mom took her last breath. That was 5 years and 2 hours or an hour and a half after my sister died, to the day. So, they called me and I went back over there, and all those things happened that happened. I got to give away everything she had to the workers and neighbors at the facility, mostly the workers. I just loved giving. I loved that her stuff would continue. I wore her jewelry. We both had major jewelry fetishes. I wore her jewelry and a piece of her clothing every day for about 4 months until I didn't need to anymore. And what happened in those times, and this is why I think Susan wanted to talk about this, what happened was I had felt like the whole time having my mom there was such a gift for me. I had no idea of the gift that would be given to me after she died. I just had no idea that I was going to not go through the terrible grief and confusion and pain and kind of torture and suffering that I had associated with grief, that I was going to just be lifted, stay lifted in her love. I just love her. That all there was for me was love. And I never have, she died 7.5 years ago. And I never have attributed the word grief to any feeling I've had about my mom since she died. I've never felt something like grief. I miss my mom. Sometimes I wish I had a mom. It is a singular, it's very, incredibly universally special relationship. I have a little tiny backyard where I live here in Berkeley, and there's 3 urns: my mom, my sister, and my father. My dead people are right there. I see them every day, wave to them. And I talk to my mom with that urn because she's the one. And I just am so thankful that I got to have an experience that was what I call not grief. And I in no way mean to say, well, grief is optional. Because there's so much pain and suffering in death. My mom's pain about losing her daughter, it's off any scale of, it's off the scale. It's so much bigger than us. We can't even hold it. It takes so much time and effort to be able to hold it. So I'm not trying to say anything about grief being not okay. I'm just saying, in my experience, I've experienced, traumatic death. I've experienced just the grief from loved ones dying in normal ways. Just this kind of torturous grief of a violent death that is still very painful 40 years later. And then this death of my mom, just light and love. I just had no idea, is what I'm trying to say. I had no idea. I had no frame of reference that was possible. And that is what I think Susan meant when she said it kind of death can sometimes change our DNA. When my mom died, I was getting very close to retiring from the work world. I became a holistic health coach and a hospice volunteer. Working with Susan, I kind of got like a little degree program on death and dying. I mean, we brought in everybody. Susan had brought everybody in, all of the leaders in death and dying, all of their books, all of the film. And I just loved that work so much. I moved over into the death and dying realm. And I think it was Susan one day, she said, you should be an end of life doula. And I think I said, what is that? Here we are, all years later. And yeah, really, My mom's death just gave me that sense of death, that we could travel a journey towards death that was okay. That was really okay. And I know, like, I taught a couple times a study group I led on the Five Invitations by Frank Ostaseski. And that's kind of what the Five Invitations are all about, is welcome everything, let it all in, open yourself more, just then. And I just feel like my mom gave me this gift and this way to do that. And I'm just always grateful for her. And the last thing I want to say before Susan, going back to Susan, because this is supposed to be a conversation between us, and I'm sorry I've talked so long, is when my kids turned 18, they got sat down at the dining room table along with my former spouse, and everybody filled out their advanced care directive. And that is part of my mission, is like, this is a rite of passage. You become a young adult, you get to drive, you get to vote, you get to drink alcohol, you get to sign up for, the army. There's all these rights that are given to you when you turn somewhere between 18 and 21. And to me, that is one of them, is advanced care directive, if we cannot speak for ourselves, because we never know. We never know when death is going to either grab us or take us or embrace us or love us. We just never know. Okay. Sorry again, I talked so long.
Because, Rye, you know me, so I also like this is a topic that just we could talk literally people to death hearing us about this. It's like getting two Long Islanders to have a conversation where one person's like, it's perfect. Because I also grew up not far from where Rye was on Long Island at a time where these topics were never spoken about. Polite people did not speak about death, taxes, or religion. That was drilled in from a very young age. And for me, what was so bizarre is I volunteered at our local library when I was like 11, because being in our home with my parents was so very painful to me that I couldn't do it. So I went to the library and I was, I think, right, probably most people know the story. My job was to unbox the books and put the Dewey Decimal numbers on them. And one day the librarians were having a meeting, and here's 11-year-old me just on my job with my box cutter, like opening up the box of books and this book on top. When I opened the box, I was like, I gasped, because it was called On Death and Dying, and it might as well have been called Playboy 101 for an 11-year-old in 1969. And I was just like, and I like covered it. I didn't think I was supposed to look at it. And then I stole it. And I took it home and I read it under the covers with my flashlight, diligently. Thank God it was a fairly short book. And I remember at the end of like the second night of reading it, this is like a moment, like one of the sort of the like moments of my life that I figure, like on my deathbed, if I remember anything, this might be one of those moments. Like I remember sitting in my bed, finishing that book and closing it and thinking, like, very deeply inside myself, thank God there's somebody on this planet that knows what the hell's going on. And then my next thought was, you're 11 years old. You have no idea what's going on. How would you know what anybody else knows about this? But I knew that Elisabeth had something that was so true and so real, because she was looking at something that everybody else was turning their back on because it was too frightening. And she was not a woman who wanted to live her life surrounded by fear. She wanted to understand how that limits us and like what's possible if we're able to see our fear and recognize it and go beyond it, which is what she did on a fairly daily basis. But right, just listening to your story about your mom, I was, of course, thinking about, I think many of us probably are thinking about our mothers. And my mother and I had probably one of the most contentious relationships of any people I knew. And my when I started doing this work in the 80s, because my friends started, not because I was on career day and I thought, oh, thinking about death is a great thing to do. It was because my friends started to die in numbers that I was stunned by in my 30s. And I had no information about what do you do? Like, how do you manage this? are you supposed to do as a 30, 28, 29, 30-year-old person in San Francisco whose whole life up until those moments had been about everything, like living your life and not about death. But it was so clear that this was something that was right in front of my face. And so I was very lucky to meet people like Stephen Levine. Um, Years later, I met Elisabeth Kübler-Ross after 30 years of avoiding death and dying like the plague after reading that book and thinking, boy, she's really understood it. So I think, our culture's done a lot in terms of making death a very, you think about how do you see death portrayed on media, on television, just in the newspaper? It's all these horrible stories, similarly aligned to Rye's stories about how her friends died early in her life. Rye, when you told the story about the Marin, I'm just literally sitting on a trail, like literally. The mountain is right here. Mount Tamalpais is literally on a trail. Mount Tamalpais when you were telling that story, and my hackles went up. But I think like having these devastating experiences as mine were, my first death was my next door neighbor, Jimmy Vilanti, who I'll never forget because we all had gigantic crushes on him. The third grade girls, he was a ninth grader and he was brilliant and an athlete. And one night he was at home working on a chemistry set and he blew himself up, like literally blew himself up. And my father and the neighbor men all ran down to his basement and my father came back out and I don't know what my father was really like before that because I was only in third grade, but after that, it was horrible. And, um, that the experience of death is a horrifying thing that just intervenes in your life and then screws you up for the rest of your life was sort of the story that was being told and that we saw repeatedly. And the AIDS epidemic did not go a long way to change my mind about that until I met other people that had a perspective sort of different. Steve and Andrea Levine that were talking about conscious living, conscious dying. I remember dragging friends of mine to these workshops, and they were like, at first thought I was insane, which may not be untrue, but also the information they were getting in these workshops became extremely helpful for them. And making that turn from trying to avoid this at all costs to being willing to even just consider and look at it. Um, we do this training around end of life in prisons, and we talk about the difference between heaven and hell is like acknowledging the situation you're actually in instead of trying to pretend that you're in some other situation as the situation you're in is mowing you down constantly. And to be able to turn and turn towards the suffering and create some space in yourself. Like I find, like, I don't know, Ryan, maybe this is something to talk about with grief. The way I was trained as a young child was that these things, you just have to clamp them down. Just get good at keeping them to yourself. And that was a very finely honed skill. And I think the more death that I've been around, the more feel like the opposite is true. If I can find some space within myself, like make the space bigger for grief, not make it smaller and more compact, to expand in some kind of like way to like to contain the amount of grief and the amount of loss and also just the amount of joy because my mother's death was completely unexpected. In 10 days time we were able to change our entire relationship that had been very set in like concrete, I felt, for 62 years. And when she died I was missing her terribly. I felt a loss of all those 62 years that we hadn't been able to get to this place that we finally were able to get to because in her she couldn't acknowledge, really say, "I think I'm dying," but she could say, "Can people survive on, like, a sip of ginger ale and some vanilla ice cream?" And I'm like, "I don't know, you're doing it." And then she's like, "Am I losing weight yet?" I was like, "Oh my god, this is like is this really what our deathbed's gonna be about? Do we look good enough to die?" But those kind of conversations, it was clear to me that she was acknowledging these changes and that she was dying and that she was allowing a couple of us to be there with her. And in the last 10 days of her life, my mother like tried to love us in a way that she hadn't been able to during her lifetime because of her own trauma, which we didn't know about until she was 80 something years old. Um, and would not speak about. But we actually knew that her sister committed suicide when my mother was just 6 and her sister was 25. And that set a course for my mother where she could not speak about that for 80 years. It also set the course for how our family would deal with issues or problems or keep secrets because that was how we were raised. So death, illness, it's a secret. Stay in the family. You don't talk about it. So then who do you talk to when you're having these kinds of life-changing experiences as a child or as a young adult or as a 20-something-year-old who's just trying to figure out who you are in the world, and then these things happen, and where do you put your grief? What do you do with those feelings? So, Rye, to hear you speak about, I'm kind of curious for you, like from those initial experiences that were so difficult to this beautiful experience with your mother. Like, I know time passed between those experiences, a lot of time, but I'm also curious, like, what allowed you to open to the experience of her dying, coming from this very traumatic experience of what death was. I would think like just sort of the human condition would be to like, oh God, how am I going to deal with this again? But there's something that shifted that allowed you to kind of really not just deal with it, but to really take this in on a very deep level. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Thank you for that question. Before I forget, I just want to say I totally forgot all the people I lost during the AIDS crisis in LA. That
Yes.
was so important part of my story. And I went to a graduate school that had a huge amount of gay people there, more men than women. And then I volunteered in Marianne Williamson's LA Center for the Living. And, the year and a half I was there, we had about 150 men die and about 5 women. And that was also, yeah, it's hard to put words to that, but I totally forgot that. So I appreciate you bringing that up. But what had a big effect on me. About 10 of the people I had been close with, and yeah. So in terms of the question that you asked, I feel like the answer to that is like what let me be able to be open to my mom's death was it was natural. It truly was natural. I mean, my mom went through losing her daughter and her husband, as in my 40s and 50s, there were more deaths, from illness and old age. So I had kind of calibrated or recalibrated somewhat, and death. I guess it just what I'm trying to get at is that death is normal. And this experience with my mom, we both knew she was coming out to die, right? We didn't know how much time we would have. And we both wanted it to be upfront and open and to talk about. And we just did that. And so I felt like we were given the chance to have a normal experience of dying. And so it wasn't about me opening up or doing anything. It was just like being present with my mom. And was really I was really, really so grateful for it. I think by that time in my life also I wasn't carrying the trauma in this from my 20s, from all those really difficult, shocking deaths in my 20s. I wasn't carrying it the same way, and there had been some levels of healing and letting go. Um, Even though it really is like an onion that keeps peeling, because like when just talking about my friend being raped and tortured before she was executed, just talking about that a half hour ago, just all the pain is just right there. But the trauma wasn't there, the absolute trauma, and so just time goes on, and you know I got to have this time with my mom. I only had seen my mom, typically once a year, maybe twice a year, talk on the phone, so just the gift of having her be there and being able to take care of her and, having some fun. Like, I every Saturday I took her to get her hair done. That was her big thing. She had to get her hair done. And then the whole family, we all went out to eat. I got to take her to the ocean and to um a couple museums, and she played bridge, and that was a big thing, so there was the tenderness of like wanting my mom to have a good few years after the sickness that she went through with her daughter, especially. So I don't know, that's kind of my answer.
Yeah, you know, when you said being just present with her, just being with her, I just had this flash of standing outside of my mother's door when I went up. My mother, we had seen her for her 90th birthday in less than, it was in September. And like in January, my brother, who's a nurse, started sending us emails, like two emails, like 3 days apart. Like she fell, we went to the emergency room. She refused to stay. She went home at 5 in the morning. That sounds so much like my mother. I don't know why he would even report on that. It's just so typical of what my mother would do. But then the next day or 2 days later, sent it this other email. Mom was back in the hospital at 3 in the morning. Apparently, she had had a heart attack. And when she went in, the doctor told her she had to stay. And she said to the doctor, look, if I was going to have a heart attack, I could see staying in the hospital. But if I just had one, I want to go home. I'm tired. I don't feel good. I want to be in my bed. My brother sent this email, and I sent a response back that said, hey, just a reminder, last year on her 89th birthday, when we got together and we talked about advanced directives, something I had done on purpose. I said, I want to tell you about my advanced directives. I didn't want to tell them, but I wanted to open up a conversation, because if I was going to do that, I knew my mother would not want to be one up. She would have to tell everybody out of hers, which is exactly what happened. And she said, I want to be home. I want to be in my bed. Don't want to be in pain. I don't want tests. I don't want procedures. And I said, Andrew, this is exactly what she told us she would want. So bringing her home, I think we should come. And he's a nurse. So he said, she's not dying. And I said, this sounds exactly like a hospice admission note from all of these hospice meetings that we've been in for years. But he had not been in that meeting. And my mother had driven him quite crazy. And so I went, and it was clear. We got the rest of our family all came up to see her in these last 10 days of her life. But I remember standing outside of her door, dreading opening and going in, because that is how bad our relationship was. And I stood there with my hand on the door for at least probably 10 minutes, like trying to get my courage up to go in and see my mother. And I heard my niece, who was 8 at the time, and I thought, oh, they're already there. My brother and his wife had already come from LA. And I was like, oh, they're already there. It's safe for me to go in. And I opened up the door to her apartment, and my niece was sitting on the arm of my mother's recliner. My mother was quite, small at that point and sort of like sitting in her chair. And my niece just had her arm around her, and she's just said, Grandma, I just love you so much. And there was like something unlocked in me, in my mind, in my heart. And I thought, this is all that we can offer at this time. Like, we need medication, we need those things. But if I'm going to survive whatever's happening next, this is the only point of view that I can have in this moment. Like the hurt, the pain, all the things I didn't have, that was gone. Like that's still true, but also there's nothing that we can do about that now. If we're going to move forward in the same space, then Journey, my niece, set the tone. I love you. That's all. And I thought, this is the only approach I can take, and I don't know how to do it. And I was very lucky that the way was laid out in front of me, and that I said to my siblings, because we all had the same mother, and I said, hey, do you guys think that mom's trying to love us now? Because we had to check with each other. We couldn't tell. And my siblings, three of them said, it doesn't matter because there's too much water under the bridge. We're done with this. And another sibling and I were kind of like, maybe one of them had no problem with the relationship they had had. He has very poor memory. But the other, like for me, I just said to them, I want to be honest with you. After 62 years of waiting for this, I'm going to go full bore. If this is what she's doing, I'm going for it. And so we all had five very different responses to her death. But to be present something that I talked about for 30 years with people, but to really live in that, being present to what this experience was the only way through it. And sure, I missed her at the end, but I'm so incredibly grateful. Like the grief I was feeling was quite different than also the grief I felt when my friends died of AIDS and these terrible, terrible sort of deaths that they
Well,
experienced.
I think that what your words are pointing to is that I think that's what death teaches us is there's nothing else that's really important but love. I stayed in touch with my friend who was murdered mom till she died, like 25
Mhm.
years. That was really meaningful to me. I still have this huge stack of letters from which she wrote me back. When my mom was dying on her deathbed, she was like, "Is it okay if I go, honey?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's real." And that's the space, right? It's just the love. And I think that's also what why death gives us so much in life is because then we remember love is all there is. And I wanted to tell this little story about my mom's death that I don't think I've told before, but I was like, "Hey, mom, we're Jewish, not religious." And it's like, "Hey, mom, what about, some Jewish death tradition?" She's like what? And I said, "Well, how about a rabbi that you get to have a conversation with who will then have to do your memorial service? And you could just meet her and have a conversation." I had identified this wonderful rabbi. And my mom was like, "No, you don't do a memorial service. Nobody will care about me. I'm like, nobody knows me. I'm like, if it's okay with you, I'd really like to do this." And she said, "Okay." So, you know, so the rabbi comes and tries to get to know my mom a little, and my mom loves attention. So she's getting into the conversation, and then she says, "The important thing for me is I don't want my body to be alone after my death." And this is a Jewish tradition. It's called Shmira, where we don't leave the body alone. And Jews tend to bury the body or otherwise dispose of the body quickly. The idea is that um, there's about 3-day period of time where the soul is separating from the body, and that everything we can do to treat the body with the utmost respect and dignity helps the soul move on. And this was when my sister died. She didn't want her body alone, and the same went with her death. And so we made sure that happened. But we had this memorial, and there were 50 people there. My mom thought there would be like 3. There were 50 people there. People that I worked with came. My cousin who lives in Santa Cruz came. My stepson came. I mean, all the people in her facility came. My financial advisor loved her, sent huge flowers. This is the thing. This is love. This is these are expressions of love. The rabbi knew some words that she could say. She was, all of this supports, to me, the soul, the spirit to move on with love. And for those of us are here, it lets us enter into that, Ram Dass's "We're all walking each other home," that it's all about love, how we care for the body, washing and sitting with it. It's just all love. And that's the gift of death, is to just stay close to the love.
No, right. I'm listening to this and I'm thinking about like your experience with your mom and my experience with my mother, but also I'm thinking about my experience with my father, and our relationship was quite brutal. And, love was not really a word I would use to describe any of it ever. And somebody asked me, was like, how do you show up for him at the end of his life, which I did for the last 2 weeks of his life. And that was really hard also because he was just continuing to push away as far as he could. Like he wanted everybody away from him emotionally. He didn't want his only question in those 10 days is he said, do I have to pay for a casket if I want to be cremated? His only concern was about money at that point. That was the only thing he could speak about. He was 67. This was shocking to him that he was dying because he'd never really been sick any day in his life. And I was like, "No, Dad, you don't. He goes, okay, just put me in a cardboard box." And I was like, okay, then. That was the only thing he wanted to know about. That was the only thing he seemed to care about, that, and that we didn't play any bird music. And we were playing, the doctor was like, play music, play things that will make him relaxed. I was like, if you met my father, there's nothing we're going to play that's going to make that man relax. But he was adamant that he was not going to listen to bird music while he was dying, or bird songs or forest songs. So, it's very hard to show up to somebody who has been abusive to you in your life. It's very hard to show up for somebody who's not kind and who certainly is not appreciating anything about you being there. But you need to be there because, like, for an example, my mother was not capable of taking care of him at all. So I want to acknowledge too, for all the people sitting in this room thinking, like, good for you, but that, like, have you met my whoever, spouse, my child, my parent, my like friend, whatever? Like, that's also very real. And I just want to acknowledge like how that was for me when my father died in 1995. Um, the
Yeah,
night before, we had sort of a turnaround where he sort of collapsed in my arms as we were moving him back to bed from the bathroom and kind of sobbed into my like neck. And I was just standing there with him with my eyeballs almost popped out on like across the room like a cartoon. And my youngest brother was standing behind me, kind of holding him up. And he was just like, because we'd never seen my father like that. And
I,
um, in that moment, it was quite clear that the amount of fear he was carrying, the only language or way to navigate that was through anger and this kind of habituated response he had to the world. And that's not easy to be around when you're giving up your, like, sort of your life for a couple of weeks or however much time you're doing that, to be with somebody who's just, it's so painful to be there. Um, I'm
I
grateful
know what
still
you're
that
talking
I
about.
did it, but yeah.
Yeah, our fathers sound a little similar. I could say my father's death was very, very different for me based on our relationship. But of course, now that I'm old, older, I see it a little differently, and I have
Mhm.
more compassion and forgiveness that, how children see their fathers, their parents, and then how we grow up and we have children or we mature and we realize how human they are, and um, that it's simplistic to just call them abusive and unavailable and just angry, that it's just way more complex than that. And I think that's another gift of death is forgiveness. I mean, a lot just goes. Just a whole lot of like a portal to forgiveness that death brings. And I think that's really amazing too. It doesn't mean there's not grief or conflict or conflicted feelings. But I'm wondering, I'm seeing all these wonderful,
Yeah,
beautiful.
I was just going to ask if anybody would like to share anything, or if there's any comment or if anybody has anything they'd like to put up in the chat, please feel free to do that. But also, I don't know, down at the bottom of our page, I would imagine that every person that's alive on the planet right this minute knows where the Zoom raise your hand feature is. But in case you don't, if you move your cursor to the bottom of the page, there's a little hand like that. If anybody has anything they'd like to share, that's the easiest way to me to see that, because there's too many of you for me to see that you are all in the same sort of screen. So does anybody have anything they'd like to share? And Kimberly, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Is that because you would like to share something?
I do have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Yep.
This is beautiful. I am so grateful for this event. Do you have any insight into how to be or how different it might be when an elder has had perhaps a stroke or another factor that causes disorientation and confusion? My mother's on the East Coast and I do FaceTimes with her. I guess people call it dementia. I don't know that that's perhaps the right term, but have you worked in a way and have any advice? I would like to think that my mom could recover more cognitive clarity. She was given no post-stroke recovery by the daughter there. There's been a terrible rift in the family, and she didn't get the care that I would provide were she here in California. So, do you offer anything hopeful or instructive or resources for how we could help someone be more going through stroke recovery in particular or post-stroke, um, be more clear-minded or clear-hearted or be able to communicate? I haven't yet taken this step to have these conversations with my mother. But when someone does have that cognitive situation, I would welcome any wisdom you would either like to share on that for the benefit of those who are dealing with this really relatively unexpected phenomenon in our family. My mom's now 94, but a year ago, this wasn't an issue. Even 6 months ago, this wasn't an issue.
Yeah, I think, this is a question a lot that comes up as an end of life doula because there is so many people suffering with cognitive decline. And I think that every case is really different. Like sometimes people like your mom's dealing with recovering from a stroke, and there's a lot of people in their 90s that recover from major illness, major surgery, and do really well. Sometimes they don't. And I think that there's not one size fits all. There's not one uh, answer to your question, but I think the sitting with the person and being there, sometimes having a very soothing pet be with the person, so having soothing music, just to keep trying things that are soothing and calming. Music, pet, person. That's kind of how I would approach it. I think the consistency really, really helps too. So like day after day after day, and after a while, your mom might be able to soften. But these are, what you're asking, these are really complicated questions, and we don't know. There's so much interesting work being done on cognitive decline now and different changing treatment protocols, all over the world. Um, and I find that really interesting and hopeful. But I think that, I think this whole idea of keep making sure that person is treated like a fully intact human being. It's really, really important.
And also deciding whether to be honest. I made a commitment to my mother when she was here years ago and I was caring for her. We had her first brain MRI, that I would be honest. I said, Mother, if there's information for you, do you want me to be honest and tell you? And she said, yes. So if she's at her assisted care place now and turns to someone and said, oh, that's your grandmother, I'm reminding her of who she is and who we are. And I feel like I want to be a beacon of loving truth for her. So that, and I don't know how long this will last. I don't know how it will affect her, but I will remind her that she had a stroke, that this is what happened, that this is where you are, that this is who I am. So do you have any experience with that? Like to be still lovingly relaying the truth, in that I hope it will reach into her consciousness and perhaps help her stabilize, help her remember what is real instead of whatever happens to the mind when it goes into delusion. So I don't know if you have any thought on that or experience on that.
I'd like to, I just want to share this because I've just spent, and this is a different situation. I know you've mentioned that your mom had a stroke, which does often result in cognitive decline for the person because the brain has been traumatized. And for some people, it takes quite a long time for them to come back to full cognitive function. Other people don't come back to full cognitive function. But it might be worthwhile just to check in with your mom, like at this point in time, just to check again. Mom, remember or not even remember. I try never to say remember to people with cognitive decline because most of the time they can't actually remember and then feel worse. But you could just remind her that we had a conversation a while back that I had asked you if you want to know everything about what's happening with your condition. And I think it's important just check in from time to time to see if that's still, you had said yes. Is that still true for you? And
Mhm.
what would you like to know? I think there's like working in hospice for many years, we would have hospice patients that had dementia, and the way their families managed their decline or the dementia part was really interesting to watch. Everything from a woman whose granddaughter was caring for her who reminded her grandmother multiple times that her spouse had died and watched her grandmother spiral out and just be devastated, like every day for a week. And finally, the patient said to her social worker, I don't think my granddaughter's telling me the truth about what's happening because the granddaughter had decided that that was traumatic for both of them to have this conversation every day. So she just started saying things like he went to the store, which her grandmother was like, oh, okay. And she didn't have that sort of visceral response. And the granddaughter was really torn. And the social worker said, you're trying to care the best you can for your grandmother. And so just watching her responses to things will give you information about what you need to know and what you can say and not say. So if
Mhm.
she's devastated every day for hours about the death of her spouse and then she doesn't have the capacity anymore to process the information, is that useful to her, or is it more useful for her to think he's on his way back and then she doesn't remember that and moves on to the next part of her day? And I think that that is something like really the shift from what the shared reality that we sort of agree on, which we're not doing a very good job on in many parts of the world right now. What is the shared reality we're all participating in? But like your shared reality in terms of cognitive function and your mother's at this point may be shifting. And one thing I found very useful is for people to try to shift into the reality that the person that's cognitive function is shifting, that they're in. So I don't ask people things like, oh, do you remember when this happened? Or I might ask them like, I had a woman with dementia teach me this. I was visiting her as her sort of hospice volunteer. And I said to her one day, Marion, you speak about your husband so like fondly. Do you remember when you met him? And she sat there and almost burst into tears because she could not. And I felt horrible that I was causing her so much pain. And I said, do you
Mhm.
remember what it felt like when you met your husband? And she could tell me all the ways she felt, but she couldn't
Mhm.
remember the details part. And so I had to really shift the way I was like processing information or wanting to get information. I had to really shift to kind of what she was capable of giving me. And I don't know if
Mhm.
that's useful, but I know also in families, I have four siblings, and each of us, if we go outside and look at the sky, we'd have four different ideas about what it looked like. And so that didn't change for my parents' deaths. And
Mhm.
particularly with my father, with my two brothers there, 2 nights before his death, they were about to have like a major fight. They didn't want to medicate him. They didn't want to do things. They didn't want to do anything that might be useful for him. And thank God that we found out at the last minute that my parents had advanced directives locked in a safe in their basement that they had never told anybody about. And my
Mhm.
father had actually said what he wanted. So my brothers were able to like put down the swords and do what my father wanted. But I think these conversations are very complex in families where people have different ideas. And with my siblings at my mother's death, I had to just figure out what hill did I want to die on here. Like, did I want to like have a huge fight with them in the middle of this death process, or did I just want to be with her in a loving, kind way and see what happened? And that's what I opted for. And my siblings had very different experiences and processed the information very differently. But I was very glad that she had told us with her own words what she wanted, so that could be the focus, and they could feel however they wanted about that. But this is what she said she wanted, and this is the job we're doing. We're just here to support what she wants right now, and we can feel and fight about everything after she's dead. Well, right now, our job is to support what she said she wanted, and that's the focus of all of us. And that was very useful. But if you don't have that information, then it gets very hard to navigate, if that makes any sense.
Thank you for that. And I find that when I am on the phone with her and I do FaceTimes, whether it's in the garden or with the dog or with the farmer's market, my real goal is to bring her joy. How can we share moments of joy together? And that seems to be the most precious thing in life anyway, right? Is
Yes.
sharing joy. And if anything is going to heal or uplift, it's that. And I was very touched, by the Dalai Lama's book, The Book of Joy.
Mm.
I read it every night a little bit before sleep. When Kamala Harris didn't win the election, I said, I got to get that book and I'm going to start reading it. And also
Mhm.
the documentary made about that, Mission Joy. So I want to just share that in our network here, if you haven't read it or haven't seen the film, because they've seen incredible trauma. And yet to make that our mission, to find joy, especially in difficult times, is really, I think, the height of the human spirit. So thank you all for what you're doing.
I want to say one thing we talk a lot about when I work in a prison. I work in multiple prisons. We are training people in prisons to do this kind of work at the bedside with their peers. And we often talk about like at the same moment working in opposites. So like the facilitators that go in to do the training cannot wait to get into a prison. We're sitting in a room with people that cannot wait to get out of that prison. But in that space, some remarkable things happen. So when you're with somebody who's transitioning out of this life as we know it to whatever, we don't know, like people have all different beliefs, but whatever's happening next, there's this liminal space where you might be so very grief struck that your family member is changing so dramatically, but you're also in this moment where it's just profoundly clear that these moments are not moments you're going to have for another 90 years. Like these moments are so precious.
Pressure.
They're precious moments. And to be able to experience that while you're understanding that this might be the last time we have this conversation. This might, there's just this liminal space that gets very clear when you're approaching people that are very close to death, and that they're in a space sometimes that's not this space that we're living our 3D lives in. They're in that space sometimes, and they're in another space other times. And for us to have the grace to be able to move into that space with them and then back into our space can be like learning to dance, but also just joyful. It's like joyful to be able to move back and forth between those spaces so that they don't feel like, oh God, I'm not enough right now because cognitively I'm not quite getting everything. But oh, I'm loved and I'm supported and I'm having this wonderful experience because really, yes, that's beautiful.
Thank
And
you.
what everybody else in your family is going to do, you have no control over that. Like, really, I had to really let go of that because I thought I did. I was just wrong about that. Like, everybody has to do their own thing. They all have their own grief. They all have their own way of moving through these situations. And I just tried as much as possible to be clean with how I was moving through the experience for myself.
Yes. Thank you.
And I just put up the reference to what you were referring to. It's a beautiful film to watch. Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama talking about how their life is full of joy. Two men that you would think would have the most horribly traumatizing experiences, but they are not bitter people at all. They are joyful, happy people, and that is a remarkable thing to listen to. Anybody else that has a question or a comment or wants to share an experience that they've had about grief or um,
There's a
yeah.
lot of folks, a lot of wonderful faces I see here from Death
Yes.
Cafés and classes I've taught. It's just I love
Yeah.
You came
And
in, perhaps maybe somebody.
I just wanted to say about the Death Cafes, I'm going to put up a link to the next Death Cafe for those of you that haven't been to one. I would suggest maybe just checking this out, and I can talk a little bit about that. But yeah, go ahead if there's any question or anything somebody would like to share. Go ahead, Anne. You are unmuted. Please unmute.
The first time I've used that little yellow hand. That's very interesting to me. Thank you. No, thank you so much. I was trying to write what I was thinking, but just that whole idea of knowing that what I try to believe about myself and about others is that everybody's showing up to be the best person they can be that day, no matter what it might look like to other people or to themselves or to, and you talk about the parents and this
Mhm.
child and the parents and the siblings, and I have 5 lovely siblings, and I just listening to your stories just makes me weak in the knees thinking about what might be ahead. So, but thank you so much. It's just um, your stories really meant a lot.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's always wonderful to see. Anne is a regular. I hope this isn't outing you, but Anne is a regular at our events, and uh, it's just wonderful to see you in this room. So thank you for coming. And we have another question for Lee. Lee has a question. Lee, I'm going to add you down here so you can ask Rye. Why don't you go ahead? And you just want to unmute yourself. Perfect.
Yeah, I did. Thanks so much. I just wanted to express my appreciation for you both sharing about your relationships with your dad. And I had a really rough relationship living in fear and anger with my dad most of my life. But he ended up, I've been a hospice volunteer 30 years. But when it's your own family member, it's such a different thing. But he ended up in a lovely hospice facility, properly medicated for his mental illness for the first time in his life. And I was able to have a great 6 weeks, with him. And he said, well, like, why didn't we always have these good times? And it's like, well, Dad, you're on Haldol now and you're acting quite normal. But so you can have a good death with even in a bad relationship. It went well at the end. So I felt blessed.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for sharing that.
that's lovely.
And I think that's true. You can have a different type of experience if you're willing to, right? I mean, my siblings showed up and they were not willing to shift at all the way they were viewing this relationship. So they had an end to my mother's life that was very aligned with what their whole life had been about with her. I think at the end, like I was maybe just like, oh, if she's going to try to love us, like, why not? Like, let's try that because nothing else has seemed to really work. So there was like a willingness there, and I think because I saw my 8-year-old niece and just it was so simple. Like, how could she's just doing that. So like you were willing to open up to the possibility. And a friend of mine used to say a lot, and I try to remind myself of this, nothing is too good to be true. And
You
she
know,
said that about my mom very often. I was like, this is 100% too good. This is not going to happen. And then it did. And I was like, oh my God. So thank you for sharing that because yes. And thank God that your dad was able to finally get properly medicated so you could see your dad, like your dad, instead of his mental illness that's so prevalent. Right?
I
Did you want to respond? Yeah.
I wanted to tell a little story to Lee. I had a client who the daughters who were in their 60s wanted a doula to sit with their dad because he was so abusive and had been so violent and violated them in so many different ways that they were still afraid of him. He was in his bed. He could not physically move. And they were still, the physical fear response was still in them. And they wanted him to have a peaceful death, but they just didn't want to be there for it. And that was a kind of outlier case for me. And I understood how they felt. And where they were coming from. And I thought, well, that's kind of a good solution, really, what they thought of. And so I just want to say, like, end of life doulas, we do a lot of different things. And that's just, and it's like what the dying person needs, what the family needs. It's all about showing up for people wherever the need is. It's not so much about us doing what we think is right and taking charge, taking over. It's really about reflecting back, what is the need here and how can we serve? And that is also something I really, really love about the work.
I was just going to say one other thing, that it was a really good learning experience for me, because everybody in this facility said what a charming man he was and how wonderful he was. And he could be very charming to people who didn't know him, but it was such good learning for me, so that when I go to the bedside of a family, I never presume to know what those people's relationships with that dying person are. And I try to let them tell me and share with me, because to say, oh, he's so sweet, he's so kind, to someone who's been, literally the victim of horrible mental or physical abuse, so I just wait and let people tell me, because he was not a charming man.
Right, right. I hear
See,
you.
I'm thinking about when we went to see my mom, the facility. I think the facility thought we were trying to kill her because she had been otherwise fine until these incidents happened, and then all of a sudden she's on hospice and she's dying. I think they thought, oh, here's her 5 kids that don't come to see her. They're going to try to kill her. But what happened is when we talked to people at the facility, and my mother was like, never forgave us for placing her. And how could we do this? She had a whole secret life there. She had she had like all of these different groups, this social group, like people changed their actual work schedule to be on while my mother was there. I'm like, wait, time out here. My mother, I thought you were torturing her. They're like, oh, we're too busy playing cards with her or doing puzzles. I come on the weekend because your mother and I are the puzzlers here. So we do a puzzle every weekend. I was like, you come in on your day off to do a puzzle with my mother? Like, it was shocking to get all this information about a person who I was so sure was this way, to find out, well, she is that way with me, but with other people, she's a completely different person. So I just want to, I noticed the time. So thank you. It's just a story. I was just like, oh, your dad also had a secret life at his facility. Um, so I want to just thank you, Rye, so much for this conversation. I want to let people know that Rye facilitates a death cafe that is just wonderful, and she's been doing that for many, many years. The next one, we sadly, because I was not normally Rye's like twice a month. She's doing the death cafe. She has to be gone next Tuesday, and I was already scheduled for something at my day job, so I wasn't able to make up for it. So we're canceling that. But the next one we're going to have, I think, is on the 25th. It's the second and fourth Tuesday of the month. I'm going to post that so people could register for it. And I also am going to post another event that we are having next Thursday with a woman whose name is Diane Button. She also does death doula work and has had quite an interesting sort of trajectory. I loved the stories of how people get to do this work, because many of us were not, definitely almost nobody I've ever heard was like, oh yeah, in career day in high school, I thought this sounded good. So I got on that line. That just is not the way most people get to this work. So listening to the stories, this is Diane Button next Thursday at 10 o'clock. And you will get a Zoom link for that prior to 3 minutes before the event starts. Rye, I just want to thank you so much. I would encourage you all to come to check out a Death Cafe. Rye, hopefully we'll be offering some more like one-off classes here. And we'll be sharing if people want to. Rye, would you put up your email address so if people would like to join for any of the classes that you're offering outside of here, that they're able to do that? And in the meanwhile, we will be offering more events. And I'm going to just put up one other thing before we sign off and say goodbye. I know some of you have done this. This is for those of you that are able to make a donation. This is how we're able to keep these events free. And Ken Ross and I are very cognizant of the changing economics for people and really want to make these available for people who want to be here, who need to be here, and who may not have other ways of getting information. And the way we've been able to do that so far, we don't get any grant money. We don't get sponsorship money from anywhere. We get money from people who make individual donations to the foundation. And there's a way that you're able to do that. So I want to thank you all on behalf of the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation for joining us. I'd like to thank Rye for the good work she's been doing for the last 10 years as a death doula, as a death educator, as the death cafe leader for both the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation and Mission Hospice. And thank you all for taking the time to spend with us today. And I hope this conversation was useful to you and your loved ones. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn off the official recording now, which is something I rarely remember to do. And then I'm going to stay for about 5 minutes afterwards. I'm not sure if Rye can, but thank you all. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation event.
Thank you.